Aldrics Open Heart.
France, 1918.
Lillian Wright had been searching for answers when she came across an abandoned military outpost. The cells were empty, untouched for months except for a single name, carved deep into the stone.
NB.
Nathaniel Blackwood. But the last record of him placed him hundreds of miles away. Chapter 1. The Whispers of Absence. The wind, a cruel, biting thing, whipped across the desolate fields of France, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the faintest whisper of wood smoke. Lillian Wright pulled her worn woolen coat tighter around her, the threadbare fabric offering little protection against the November chill. 1918. The war, they said, was nearing its end, but the landscape still bore the fresh, gaping wounds of battle. Trenches, like carelessly drawn scars, zigzagged across the fields, leading to nowhere but deeper into the heart of a conflict that had swallowed an entire generation. Lillian walked with a determined stride, her boots sinking slightly into the mud-caked path. She was a woman of purpose, a purpose born of grief and fueled by an unshakable resolve. Her once vibrant auburn hair, now streaked with premature gray, was pulled back in a severe bun, revealing the sharp angles of her face and the determined set of her jaw. The lines around her eyes, etched deep by worry and sleepless nights, spoke of a sorrow that had taken root and refused to yield. She was searching, always searching. She'd come to France with the American Red Cross, hoping to find some solace in service, some distraction from the gaping hole that had been ripped into her life. Her brother, Thomas, a young, idealistic doctor, had volunteered for the front lines, eager to heal, to mend, to make a difference. He'd written to her faithfully, his letters filled with a youthful optimism that even the horrors of war couldn't completely extinguish. Then, the letters had stopped. The official telegram had been brutally brief, missing in action. Presumed the word had hung in the air, unspoken but heavy with finality. Lillian had refused to accept it. She had to know. She owed it to Thomas, to the memory of their shared childhood, to the bond that even death couldn't sever. The village of Verrières was little more than a cluster of shattered buildings, a ghost town haunted by the echoes of shelling and the lingering despair of its absent inhabitants. The few remaining villagers, their faces etched with weariness and loss, eyed her with a mixture of suspicion and pity. An American woman, alone, wandering through the remnants of their lives. She didn't blame them. Trust was a luxury no one could afford in these times. She'd been following a thread, a whisper, a rumor passed from one weary soldier to another. A field hospital, abandoned months ago, just outside the village. Thomas had been stationed nearby, according to his last letter. It was a long shot, a desperate grasp at any semblance of hope, but it was all she had. The sun, a pale, watery disk in the overcast sky, began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ravaged landscape. The air grew colder, the wind more insistent. Lillian pressed on, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. She had to find the hospital before nightfall. She'd learned to read the signs of war, the subtle clues left behind in the debris and the silence. The twisted metal of a discarded ambulance, the scattered remnants of bandages, the lingering scent of disinfectant and decay. These were the breadcrumbs that led her through the labyrinth of loss. The hospital, when she finally found it, was a grim sight. A sprawling, stone building, once grand, now bearing the scars of heavy shelling. Windows were shattered, the roof partially collapsed, and the grounds overgrown with weeds. It stood silent, a sentinel of suffering, guarding its secrets within its crumbling walls. Lillian felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of fear and anticipation. This was it, the end of one path, the beginning of another. She took a deep breath, the cold air burning in her lungs, and stepped through the shattered doorway, into the heart of the abandoned sanctuary. The silence inside was profound, broken only by the rustling of the wind and the faint creak of a loose shutter. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence filled with the ghosts of the wounded and the dying. It was a silence that held, perhaps, the the answer she had been seeking for so long. And it was a silence that, somehow, felt deeply, unsettlingly familiar. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Empty Fort. The interior of the hospital was a cavernous space, filled with the debris of its hasty abandonment. Cots lay overturned, their thin mattresses stained with the ghosts of countless wounds. Tables were scattered with medical instruments, rusted and dull, reflecting the fading light that filtered through the shattered windows. The air was thick with the scent of dust, decay, and the lingering, almost metallic tang of old blood. Lillian moved slowly, cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. Each room she entered told a story of pain and desperation, of lives fought for and lost. She could almost hear the cries of the wounded, the hushed whispers of the nurses, the frantic activity of a place overwhelmed by the ceaseless tide of casualties. She found a small office, relatively untouched by the shelling. A desk, covered in a thick layer of dust, stood against one wall. Papers, scattered and yellowed with age, lay strewn across its surface. Lillian picked up one, a medical chart, its ink faded but still legible. The name on the chart was unfamiliar, but the handwriting it was meticulous, precise, with a distinctive flourish in the loops of the Y and G. A flicker of recognition sparked within her, a faint memory tugging at the edges of her consciousness. She continued her search, drawn deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of the hospital. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional scuttling of a rat or the mournful sigh of the wind as it whistled through the broken panes of glass. She found a chapel, its stained glass windows miraculously intact, depicting scenes of healing and hope. A single candle, long since extinguished, sat on the altar, a testament to the prayers that had been offered within these walls. It was in the basement, a dark, damp space used for storage, that she found the unexpected. It wasn't part of the hospital proper, but a series of older, stone-walled rooms connected by a narrow, winding passage. The air down here was colder, heavier, and the scent of decay was more pronounced. These rooms, she realized with a growing sense of unease, had been used for a different purpose.
They were cells.
Small, cramped, and utterly devoid of comfort. Most were empty, their doors hanging open, revealing the stark emptiness within. But one cell at the very end of the passage was different. Its door was closed, secured with a heavy, rusted padlock. And on the wall, just beside the door, something had been carved into the stone. Lillian approached cautiously, her heart beating faster. She held her breath, the silence pressing in on her. The carving was crude, rough, but unmistakable. Initials, intertwined, and a name beneath them.
N.B. Nathaniel Blackwood.
The name sent a jolt through her, a shock of recognition that left her momentarily breathless. Nathaniel Blackwood. It was a name she hadn't heard in years, a name associated with a past she had tried to bury, a past filled with both joy and heartbreak. A past that was inextricably linked to her brother. But it couldn't be. Nathaniel Blackwood she didn't even know where he was. The last she'd heard, he was serving with the British forces, hundreds of miles away, on a different sector of the front. What would he be doing here, in an abandoned French hospital, locked in a cell? The questions swirled in her mind, a chaotic vortex of confusion and disbelief. She reached out, her fingers tracing the rough outline of the carving. The stone was cold, unforgiving, but the name was a spark, igniting a flame of hope in the darkness. She had to find out more. She had to know how this name, this echo from her past, had ended up here, in this desolate place. She had to know if it was connected to Thomas's disappearance. The padlock on the cell door was old, rusted, but it was still strong. She needed something to break it, something to open the door and reveal the secrets hidden within. The answer, she felt, was waiting for her in that cell. And she would not leave until she found it, no matter the cost. The name had stirred something within her, something long dormant, something she thought she had lost forever. Hope, fragile and tentative, began to bloom again. Chapter 3. The carving on the wall. Lillian searched the surrounding cells, her hands trembling with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The air was thick with the musty scent of damp stone and decay, and the silence was punctuated only by the drip, drip, drip of water seeping through cracks in the ceiling. She found nothing in the first few cells, just empty spaces, cold and devoid of any trace of human presence beyond the bare stone walls and rusted iron bars. In the fourth cell, however, she found something. Lying on the floor, half hidden beneath a pile of rubble, was a metal bar, likely a broken piece from one of the cots upstairs. It was heavy, solid, and looked strong enough to withstand the force she needed. She picked it up, the cold metal biting into her gloved hand. It was a grim tool, a symbol of the violence that permeated this place, but it was also a key, a potential means of unlocking the secrets held within the locked cell. She returned to the cell with the carved name, her heart pounding in her chest.
N.B. Nathaniel Blackwood.
The name resonated within her, a haunting melody from a past she had tried to forget. She remembered Nathaniel as a young man, full of life and laughter, with eyes that held a hint of mischief and a smile that could melt the coldest heart. He had been Thomas's closest friend, a constant presence in their lives before the war had swept them all away on its tide of destruction. She positioned the metal bar against the padlock, her hands shaking slightly. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves, and brought the bar down with all her strength. The sound echoed through the silent basement, a sharp, metallic clang that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the building. The padlock held. She tried again, and again, each blow sending jarring vibrations up her arms. The muscles in her shoulders screamed in protest, but she refused to give up. She had to get inside. She had to know what secrets the cell held. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, the padlock gave way. It snapped, the broken pieces falling to the floor with a dull thud. Lillian stood there for a moment, her breath ragged, her heart pounding. The door was now unlocked, the way open. She hesitated, a sudden wave of fear washing over her. What if she didn't find what she was looking for? What if the truth was worse than the uncertainty? But she couldn't turn back now. She had come too far, endured too much, to be stopped by fear. She pushed open the cell door, the hinges groaning in protest. The interior of the cell was dark, shrouded in shadow. The only light came from the narrow passage outside, casting a dim, flickering glow on the stone walls. Lillian stepped inside, the metal bar still clutched tightly in her hand. The cell was small, barely large enough for a cot and a small stool, both of which were missing. The walls were bare, except for more carvings, similar to the one outside. Initials, names, dates, a desperate attempt by prisoners to leave some mark of their existence, some testament to their suffering. Lillian moved closer, examining the carvings more closely. She found more initials, more names, but none that she recognized. And then, in a corner of the cell, almost hidden from view, she saw it. It wasn't a name or initials, but a drawing. A crude, almost childlike sketch, etched into the stone with something sharp. It depicted a bird, a swallow, in flight. And beneath the bird, a single word, hope. The drawing struck a chord within her, a deep, resonating vibration that sent shivers down her spine. Thomas used to draw swallows. He'd always had a fascination with birds, with their freedom, their ability to soar above the earthbound constraints of the world. He'd said that swallows represented hope, the promise of a return, a journey home. Lillian stared at the drawing, her eyes filling with tears. It was a sign, a message, a whisper from her brother across the vast gulf of uncertainty. He had been here. He had been in this cell. And he had left this drawing, this symbol of hope, as a testament to his enduring spirit. But where was he now? The drawing offered no answers, only a confirmation of his presence, a confirmation that fueled both her hope and her fear. She traced the outline of the swallow with her finger, a silent vow passing between her and the ghost of her brother. She would find him. She would bring him home. The cell, she realized, held more questions than answer, but she would keep the image of the swallow close to her heart. Chapter 4. Letters from a lost man driven by the discovery of the swallow drawing. Lillian returned to the hospital's main floor, determined to find anything that might shed more light on Thomas's presence there and Nathaniel's connection to it all. The fading daylight cast long, eerie shadows through the broken windows, painting the ruined rooms in shades of gray and black. She focused her search on the office she'd found earlier, the one with the dusty desk and scattered papers. She began sifting through the documents, her fingers brushing against the brittle paper. Most were mundane records, patient lists, supply requisitions, duty rosters, the bureaucratic detritus of a wartime hospital. But then, tucked away in a drawer, she found a small, wooden box. It was unlocked, and when she lifted the lid, she found a collection of letters. The letters were tied together with a faded ribbon, and the handwriting on the top envelope was immediately familiar. It was Thomas's. Her heart skipped a beat as she untied the ribbon and carefully opened the first letter. The paper was thin, almost translucent, and the ink was faded in places, but the words were still legible. The letter was dated several months earlier, and it was addressed to Nathaniel. Lillian's breath caught in her throat. This was a direct link between her brother and the man whose name she had found carved on the prison wall. She began to read, her eyes scanning the words hungrily. Thomas wrote of the horrors of the front lines, the constant shelling, the endless stream of casualties. He wrote of his despair, his disillusionment, his growing fear that the war would never end. But he also wrote of Nathaniel, of his unwavering courage, his loyalty, his kindness in the face of unimaginable brutality. "Nathaniel keeps me going, Lillian," Thomas wrote. "He's the strongest man I know, both in body and spirit. He's seen things that would break most men, but he never loses hope. He reminds me of what we're fighting for, of the world we hope to build after this madness is over." Lillian continued reading, letter after letter, each one revealing a deeper glimpse into the bond between Thomas and Nathaniel. They had been stationed together, fought side by side, shared the horrors and the fleeting moments of camaraderie that defined life in the trenches. They had become more than friends, they were brothers in arms, bound together by a shared experience that no one outside the war could ever truly understand. But then, the tone of the letters began to change. Thomas wrote of a growing unease, a sense of something amiss. He mentioned rumors of spies, of sabotage, of betrayal within their own ranks. He wrote of a mission, a secret operation that Nathaniel had been assigned to, an operation that Thomas feared was too dangerous. "I don't know what's going on, Lillian," he wrote in one letter. "But something's not right. Nathaniel's changed. He's more withdrawn, more secretive. He won't tell me what's happening, and it's tearing me apart. I'm afraid for him, Lillian. I'm afraid he's walking into a trap." The last letter was dated just a few days before Thomas went missing. It was short, frantic, filled with a sense of urgency and desperation. "They've taken him, Lillian. They've arrested Nathaniel. They say he's a traitor, a spy. I don't believe it. I know he would never betray his country, his comrades. I have to help him. I have to prove his innocence. But I don't know how. I'm running out of time." The letter ended abruptly, without a signature. Lillian sat there, stunned, the letter trembling in her hand. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was terrifying. Nathaniel, a traitor? It seemed impossible. But if he had been arrested, imprisoned in that cell, where was he now? And what had happened to Thomas, who had so desperately tried to help him? A new wave of determination surged through her. She had to find out the truth. She had to uncover the conspiracy that had ensnared both her brother and the man he so clearly admired. She carefully placed the letters back in the box, a precious link to the past, a guide to the future. She knew now what she had to do. She had to find someone who could tell her more about Nathaniel, about the mission, about the accusations against him. She had to find someone who knew the truth. And the weight of two men's fates now rested, unexpectedly, on her shoulders. Chapter 5. Shadows of the Somme. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose shutters and whistling through the cracks in the walls, a mournful symphony accompanying Lillian's growing unease. Armed with the letters and the knowledge of Nathaniel's alleged betrayal, she knew she needed to find someone who had served with him, someone who could shed light on the events leading up to his arrest. The local villagers, she reasoned, were unlikely to be of much help. They were understandably wary of strangers, and their knowledge of military affairs was likely limited. She decided to head towards Amiens. It was a larger city, further from the front lines, but still within the zone of military operations. There was a British headquarters there, she recalled from a map she'd seen, and a larger hospital that was still functioning. Someone there, she hoped, might be able to provide some answers. The journey was arduous. The roads were rutted and muddy, and the constant threat of shelling made travel dangerous. She passed through deserted villages, their buildings scarred by war, their fields barren and desolate. The landscape was a grim reminder of the devastation that had swept across this land, a testament to the human cost of conflict. She walked for hours, her feet aching, her body weary, but her spirit remained unbroken. She clung to the hope that she was getting closer to the truth, closer to finding out what had happened to Thomas and Nathaniel. The image of the swallow, etched into the cold stone of the cell, kept recurring in her mind, a symbol of hope and resilience in the face of despair. As dusk began to settle, she saw the faint glow of lights in the distance. It was a small village, seemingly untouched by the worst of the fighting. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She found a small inn, its windows dimly lit, the sound of voices and laughter spilling out into the night. It was a welcome sight, a haven of warmth and humanity in the midst of the surrounding desolation. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to enter. She was a woman, alone, in a war-torn country. But she had no choice. She needed shelter, food, and information. She pushed open the door, the warmth of the interior washing over her. The inn was crowded, filled with soldiers, mostly British, their uniforms dusty and worn. They looked up as she entered, their eyes curious, some wary, some openly appraising. Lillian ignored their stares, her gaze scanning the room, searching for someone who might be able to help her. She spotted an older officer, sitting alone at a table in the corner. He had a kind face, etched with lines of experience, and his uniform, though worn, bore the insignia of a captain. He looked up as she approached, his eyes questioning. "Excuse me, Captain," Lillian said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I wonder if I might ask you a few questions." The captain nodded, his expression guarded.
What is it you want to know?
Lillian took a deep breath. "I'm looking for information about a soldier, a Captain Nathaniel Blackwood. He was serving with the British forces, but I believe he was arrested, accused of being a spy." The captain's eyes narrowed slightly. "Blackwood? I knew him. Served with him on the Somme. A brave man, one of the best." But he paused, his gaze shifting away. "But he was a traitor. He betrayed his country, his comrades." Lillian felt a chill run down her spine. The confirmation, even from a stranger, was a blow. But how?
Why?
The captain sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "It's a long story, and a complicated one. There was a mission, a secret operation to infiltrate the German lines. Blackwood was chosen to lead it. He had the skills, the language, the experience. But something went wrong. We lost contact with him. And then we received information, credible information, that he had defected to the enemy. But Thomas, my brother, he wrote that he didn't believe it," Lillian interjected, her voice rising in desperation. "He said Nathaniel would never betray his country." The captain looked at her with a mixture of pity and understanding. "Your brother, he was close to Blackwood, wasn't he? It's hard to accept the truth when it involves someone you care about." But the evidence was overwhelming. Blackwood was seen meeting with German officers. He was providing them with information, vital information that cost us dearly.
He paused.
He was court-martialed in absentia, sentenced to death. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Lillian felt a wave of despair wash over her. Nathaniel, a traitor, sentenced to death? It seemed impossible, unthinkable. But the captain's words, his conviction, were hard to dismiss. Had she been wrong? Had she been chasing a ghost, a lie? The world spun for a moment, and a sob caught in her throat. She couldn't surrender, not yet. Not until she was absolutely certain. Chapter 6. The Nurse and the Captain. Lillian struggled to maintain her composure. The captain's words had been a devastating blow, casting a dark shadow over the fragile hope she had been clinging to. But she couldn't afford to break down, not now. She needed to gather more information, to understand the full context of the accusations against Nathaniel. "Captain," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "you said you served with Nathaniel on the Somme. Can you tell me more about him? About the kind of man he was?" The captain leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant, lost in the memories of that brutal battle. The Somme, it was hell on earth. The mud, the blood, the constant shelling, it changed us all. But Nathaniel, he was different. He had a strength, a resilience, that I've never seen in any other man. He never complained, never faltered, even when things were at their worst. He paused, a flicker of something akin to admiration in his eyes. He was a natural leader. The men respected him, trusted him implicitly. He had a way of inspiring them, of making them believe that they could survive, even in the face of impossible odds. He saved my life, you know. Pulled me out of a shell crater, under heavy fire. I owe him everything. Lillian listened intently, her heart aching with a mixture of grief and confusion. How could this man, this hero, be the same man who was accused of treason? But then, the captain continued, his voice dropping, something changed. He became withdrawn, secretive. He started taking risks, unnecessary risks. He seemed to be driven by something I couldn't understand. "The mission," Lillian said, her voice barely a whisper. "Thomas wrote about a mission, a secret operation." The captain nodded. "It was a desperate gamble. We were losing the war, and we needed a breakthrough. Nathaniel was chosen because he was fluent in German, and he had a deep understanding of German culture. He was supposed to infiltrate a German intelligence unit, gather information, and sabotage their operations. But something went wrong," Lillian said, completing his thought. "Yes," the captain confirmed. "We lost contact with him. And then we received reports from multiple sources that he was collaborating with the enemy. He was seen meeting with German officers, passing them information, maps, troop deployments, but were these reports verified?" Lillian asked, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. Could they have been false? Could someone have been trying to frame him? The captain hesitated. "It's possible, I suppose. But the evidence was compelling. And there were witnesses. Soldiers who had served with him, who claimed to have seen him with the enemy." Lillian felt a surge of frustration. "But who were these witnesses? Can I speak to them?" The captain shook his head. "Most of them are dead. Killed in action. The few who survived, they're scattered, reassigned to different units. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to track them down." Lillian felt a sense of despair closing in on her. She was running out of options, running out of time. But then, she noticed a woman sitting at a nearby table, watching them intently. She was a nurse, her uniform crisp and clean, her face pale but determined. She had been listening to their conversation, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Something that Lillian couldn't quite decipher. The nurse met Lillian's gaze and held it for a moment. Then, she gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible. It was a signal, a silent invitation. Lillian excused herself from the captain and walked over to the nurse's table. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation," the nurse said, her voice low and discreet. "I know about Captain Blackwood, and I know the truth." Lillian's heart leaped with a sudden surge of hope. "You do? But how?" The nurse glanced around the room, making sure they weren't being overheard. "I was stationed at the hospital in Verrières," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one that's now abandoned. I was there when they brought Captain Blackwood in, and I know he wasn't a traitor." She leaned closer. "And I may know where he is now." The words were a lifeline, thrown to Lillian in the depths of her despair. A new path, shrouded in secrecy and danger, had suddenly opened before her. Chapter 7. A Promise Under Fire. The nurse, whose name was Eleanor, led Lillian to a small, dimly lit room at the back of the inn. The room was sparsely furnished, with just a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot in the corner. The air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and antiseptic, a lingering reminder of the inn's proximity to the war. "We need to be careful," Eleanor said, closing the door behind them. "There are spies everywhere and people loyal to the wrong convictions. We can't trust anyone." Lillian nodded, her heart pounding. She was stepping into a world of shadows and secrets, a world where the lines between truth and lies were blurred, and where danger lurked around every corner. "You said you know the truth about Captain Blackwood," Lillian said, her voice urgent. "Please tell me everything." Eleanor took a deep breath, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I was one of the nurses assigned to care for Captain Blackwood when he was brought to the hospital. He was badly injured, suffering from shell shock and multiple wounds. He was delirious, rambling, but even in his delirium, he kept repeating one thing: 'I'm not a traitor. I have to get the message through.'" "What message?" Lillian asked, her curiosity piqued. "He never said," Eleanor replied, "but he was clutching something in his hand, a small, metal cylinder. He wouldn't let go of it, even when we tried to treat his wounds. He kept saying it was vital, that it had to reach headquarters." "Did you see what was inside?" Eleanor shook her head.
No.
"But I saw the look on his face, the desperation in his eyes. I knew it was important. And I knew he wasn't a traitor. He was a patriot, fighting for his country, just like the rest of us." "But then what happened?" Lillian asked. "Why was he imprisoned? Why was he accused of being a spy?" Eleanor's expression darkened. "There was a colonel, a man named Moreau. He was in charge of the investigation. He was convinced that Blackwood was guilty. He interrogated him relentlessly, even though he was in no condition to answer questions. He twisted his words, misinterpreted his actions, and built a case against him based on flimsy evidence and hearsay."
"But why?"
Lillian asked, bewildered. "Why would he do that?" "I don't know," Eleanor said. "But I suspect there was more to it than met the eye. Moreau was ambitious, ruthless, and he had a reputation for bending the rules to get what he wanted. I think he saw Blackwood as an obstacle, a threat to his own career. And I think he used the mission as an opportunity to get rid of him." "But the witnesses," Lillian said. "The soldiers who claimed to have seen him with the enemy, they were lying," Eleanor said firmly. "Or they were mistaken. I know it. I saw the fear in their eyes when they testified. They were being coerced, threatened. Moreau had something on them, something he was using to control them." Lillian felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards this Colonel Moreau, this man who had so callously destroyed Nathaniel's reputation and condemned him to death. "So, where is Captain Blackwood now?" Lillian asked, her voice filled with a renewed sense of hope. Eleanor hesitated. "I don't know for sure. But I heard whispers that he was being held in a secret prison, somewhere near the front lines."
"À Place Caled le Corbeau Noir."
The Black Crow. The name sent a shiver down Lillian's spine. It sounded ominous, dangerous. "And you believe he's still alive?" "I have to," Eleanor said, her eyes shining with conviction. "I made him a promise. When he was being taken away, he looked at me and he said, 'Help me. Tell them the truth.' I promised him I would. And I won't break that promise." She looked intently at Lillian. "And neither will you." A shared determination, forged in the crucible of war and whispered secrets, now bound them together. Chapter 8. The Spy in the Ward. Eleanor's revelation about Le Corbeau Noir and her promise to Nathaniel ignited a new fire within Lillian. She was no longer just searching for answers, she was on a mission. A rescue operation fraught with danger and uncertainty. "We need a plan," Lillian said, her mind racing. "How do we find this prison? And how do we get inside?" Eleanor paced the small room, her brow furrowed in concentration. Le Corbeau Noir is not an official prison. It's a holding facility, used by military intelligence for interrogations and other things. It's off the books, so to speak. No one is supposed to know about it. "But you do," Lillian said, her gaze unwavering. Eleanor nodded. "I overheard some officers talking about it, months ago. They were drunk, careless. They mentioned its location, a ruined chateau, somewhere near the village of Montdidier. Montdidier. The name rang a bell. Lillian remembered seeing it on a map, a small town strategically located near a crucial railway junction. It was a dangerous area, close to the front lines, heavily fortified. It won't be easy, Eleanor said, her voice grim. The chateau is heavily guarded, and the surrounding area is crawling with soldiers. We'll need help. Someone on the inside, someone who can provide us with information, a way in. Lillian thought for a moment. The hospital in Amiens, she said. You said there were spies everywhere. What if there's someone there, someone working for the other side, who might have access to information about Le Corbeau Noir? Eleanor's eyes widened.
It's a long shot, she said.
But it's possible. There's been a lot of strange activity at the hospital lately. New staff, unfamiliar faces, whispered conversations in the corridors. I've always suspected something wasn't right. We need to go to Amiens, Lillian said, her voice firm. We need to find the spy, and we need to convince them to help us. The journey to Amiens was fraught with peril. They traveled under cover of darkness, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the shadows. They encountered checkpoints, patrols, and the constant threat of shelling. But they pressed on, driven by their shared determination to rescue Nathaniel and uncover the truth. When they arrived at the hospital in Amiens, it was a scene of controlled chaos. Wounded soldiers were being brought in constantly. The air was thick with the scent of blood and disinfectant, and the staff were working tirelessly, their faces etched with exhaustion. Eleanor, with her nurse's uniform, blended in seamlessly. Lillian, however, was an outsider, and she had to be careful. They agreed that Eleanor would try to gather information, while Lillian would remain hidden, observing, waiting for an opportunity. Eleanor spent hours moving through the wards, talking to patients, observing the staff, listening for any clues. She noticed a young orderly, a man with shifty eyes and a nervous demeanor, who seemed to be avoiding her gaze. He was new, she hadn't seen him before, and he seemed to be spending an unusual amount of time in the officers' quarters. Eleanor decided to take a risk. She approached the orderly, her voice calm and friendly. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm new here. Can you tell me where I can find the supply room?" The orderly looked at her suspiciously. "Why do you need to know?" "I'm just trying to be helpful," Eleanor said, smiling disarmingly. "I'm a nurse, and I want to make sure I know where everything is." The orderly hesitated, then gave her directions. But as he turned to leave, Eleanor noticed something. A small, metal cylinder, tucked inside his pocket. It was identical to the one she had seen Nathaniel clutching in the hospital at Verrières. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was their spy. She had to find a way to talk to him, alone, to convince him to help them. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the danger was escalating rapidly. She had to be careful. One wrong move could betray them both. And the orderly cylinder was a blatant connection to Nathaniel. Chapter 9. Betrayal at Dawn. Eleanor knew she had to act quickly. The orderly, whose name she later learned was Jean-Luc, was clearly involved in something clandestine, and the metal cylinder was the key. She followed him, discreetly, as he moved through the hospital, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and fear. She waited for an opportunity, a moment when he was alone and vulnerable. It came when he entered a small, storage room at the end of a long corridor. Eleanor followed him inside, closing the door behind her. Jean-Luc turned, startled, his eyes widening in alarm. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I know who you are," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "And I know what you're carrying." She nodded towards his pocket, where the metal cylinder was hidden.
Jean-Luc's face pâlide.
He reached for the cylinder, his hand shaking. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Eleanor said.
"I saw it."
"It's the same kind of cylinder that Captain Blackwood had. The one he was carrying when he was arrested." Jean-Luc's eyes darted around the room, as if looking for an escape. "I can't talk about it." "You have to," Eleanor said, her voice pleading. "Captain Blackwood is innocent. He's being framed. And you're the only one who can help us prove it." Jean-Luc hesitated, his gaze shifting between Eleanor and the door. He was clearly torn, caught between his loyalty to his handlers and the realization that he was involved in something deeply wrong. "They'll kill me," he whispered, his voice filled with fear. "If I betray them, they'll kill me." "They'll kill Captain Blackwood if you don't," Eleanor countered. "He's already been sentenced to death. You're his only hope." Jean-Luc looked at her, his eyes filled with despair. He knew she was right. He had been manipulated, used, and now he was faced with a choice that could cost him his life. "All right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll help you. But we have to be careful. They have eyes everywhere." He told Eleanor everything. He was a double agent, working for both the British and the Germans. He had been recruited by Colonel Moreau, the same man who had orchestrated Nathaniel's arrest. Moreau had promised him money, power, and a safe passage out of the war. "Moreau is the real traitor," Jean-Luc said. "He's been selling information to the Germans for months. He used Captain Blackwood as a scapegoat to cover his own tracks." The metal cylinder, Jean-Luc explained, contained proof of Moreau's treachery. It was a coded message detailing his communications with the German High Command. Nathaniel had intercepted the message, and he was trying to get it to headquarters when he was captured. "Moreau knows about the cylinder," Jean-Luc said. "He's desperate to get it back. That's why he had Captain Blackwood arrested. He's afraid the truth will come out." "And Le Corbeau Noir?" Lillian asked, who had been hiding behind a stack of crates, listening to their conversation. "What is it? Where is it?" Jean-Luc looked at her, surprised. He hadn't realized there was someone else in the room. "Le Corbeau Noir is a secret prison," he said. "It's where Moreau takes his special prisoners. People he wants to disappear. It's located in a ruined chateau, just outside Montdidier." Lillian and Eleanor exchanged a look. They had confirmation. They knew where Nathaniel was being held, and they had proof of his innocence. But they also knew that time was running out. "We have to get the cylinder to headquarters," Eleanor said. "And we have to rescue Captain Blackwood." "I can help you," Jean-Luc said. "I know the layout of the chateau. I can get you inside." But just as he said those words, the door burst open, and 2 soldiers stormed into the room. They were armed, and their faces were grim. "You're under arrest," one of the soldiers said, pointing his rifle at Jean-Luc. "For treason." Lillian and Eleanor were caught completely off guard. They had been betrayed. Someone had overheard their conversation. Someone had alerted Moreau. The soldiers seized Jean-Luc, roughly shoving him towards the door. Before being hauled out, with a meaningful glance, he mouthed one desperate phrase. "The well." Then he was gone. Dawn was just breaking, painting the sky in hues of betrayal and blood. Chapter 10. The Long Road to Amiens. The abrupt arrest of Jean-Luc left Lillian and Eleanor reeling. They were trapped, exposed, and their carefully laid plans had been shattered in an instant. They managed to slip out of the storage room unnoticed in the ensuing chaos, blending back into the bustling activity of the hospital. But they knew they couldn't stay there long. Moreau's men would be looking for them. "We have to get out of here," Eleanor whispered, her voice urgent.
Now.
They made their way through the crowded corridors, their hearts pounding, their eyes darting around nervously. They reached a side exit, a small, inconspicuous door that led to a narrow alleyway. They slipped outside, into the cool, pre-dawn air. "What do we do now?" Lillian asked, her voice filled with despair. "Jean-Luc was our only hope." Eleanor paused, her mind racing. "The well," she said, remembering Jean-Luc's last words. He said, "The well." What does it mean? Lillian thought for a moment. It could be a code, she said. A message, a location, something he couldn't say out loud. But what kind of well? Eleanor asked. A water well? A wishing well? A metaphorical well? They were standing in the alleyway, the sounds of the city slowly awakening around them. The sky was beginning to lighten, the darkness giving way to a pale, gray dawn. "The chateau," Lillian said suddenly.
Le Corbeau Noir.
Jean-Luc said it was a ruined chateau. Maybe there's a well there, a physical well, where he hid something, information, a weapon, a key. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. They had to get to Montdidier, to Le Corbeau Noir, and they had to find this well. "We need to get out of Amiens," Eleanor said. And we need to find transportation. We can't walk all the way to Montdidier. It's too far, too dangerous. They decided to head towards the railway station. It was a risky move, as it was likely to be heavily guarded, but it was their best chance of finding transportation. They moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the main streets. When they reached the station, it was a scene of controlled chaos. Soldiers were milling around, checking papers, loading supplies onto trains. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and the sound of hissing steam. Lillian and Eleanor spotted a military truck, parked near a loading platform. It was filled with supplies, and the driver was nowhere to be seen. "That's our chance," Lillian said, her eyes gleaming. "We can hide in the back, among the supplies." It was a dangerous gamble, but they were running out of options. They waited for a moment when the area was clear, then made a dash for the truck. They climbed into the back, burying themselves under a pile of blankets and crates. The truck rumbled to life, the engine sputtering and coughing. They were on their way, heading towards Montdidier, towards Le Corbeau Noir, towards an uncertain future. The journey was long and uncomfortable. They were cramped, cold, and hungry. The truck bounced and swayed, and the constant threat of discovery kept them on edge. But they endured, fueled by their determination to rescue Nathaniel and expose Moreau's treachery. As they traveled, they talked, sharing their fears, their hopes, their stories. Lillian learned more about Eleanor's past, about her life before the war, about her dreams for the future. And Eleanor learned about Lillian's brother, Thomas, and about the bond that had driven her across an ocean to find him. They were two women from different worlds, brought together by a shared tragedy and a common purpose. They were strangers, and yet they were closer than sisters, bound together by a bond of trust and mutual respect. The long road to Montdidier was a test of their resilience, a journey into the heart of darkness, a prelude to the final confrontation that awaited them. But the image of Jean-Luc being dragged away kept replaying in Lillian's mind, along with the whispered words, "The well." She held on to that hope, that slender thread of a clue, as the truck rumbled on. Chapter 11. Scars of the Past. The truck finally lurched to a halt, the engine sputtering into silence. Lillian and Eleanor, stiff and cramped from the long journey, cautiously peeked out from under the blankets. They were in a small, deserted courtyard, surrounded by crumbling stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the silence was broken only by the cawing of crows. They had arrived at Montdidier, or rather, the outskirts of it. The ruined chateau, Le Corbeau Noir, loomed before them, a grim silhouette against the gray sky. It was a massive structure, once grand, now bearing the scars of war and neglect. Windows were shattered, the roof was partially collapsed, and the walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. "This is it," Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of apprehension and determination.
Le Corbeau Noir.
They climbed out of the truck, their legs shaky, their bodies aching. They were alone, exposed, and they knew that they were walking into a trap. But they had come too far to turn back. "The well," Lillian said, remembering Jean-Luc's last words. "We need to find the well." They began to search the courtyard, their eyes scanning the ground, looking for any sign of a well. The courtyard was overgrown with weeds and littered with debris, making the search difficult. As they searched, Lillian couldn't help but think about Nathaniel, about the man he was, the man he had become. The captain's words echoed in her mind, describing him as a hero, a leader, a man of unwavering courage. But the accusations against him were so damning, so persistent. Was it possible that he had been broken by the war, that he had succumbed to the darkness? She remembered the letters, Thomas's letters, describing Nathaniel's strength, his loyalty, his kindness. She remembered the drawing of the swallow, the symbol of hope, etched into the stone of the cell. She clung to those memories, to those images, as she searched for the well, for the truth. They found it, hidden beneath a tangle of overgrown vines, near the base of a crumbling wall. It was an old, stone well, its mouth covered with a heavy, wooden lid. Lillian and Eleanor exchanged a look, their hearts pounding. This was it. This was the place Jean-Luc had been referring to. They struggled to lift the lid, their muscles straining. It was heavy, and the wood was rotten and splintered. Finally, with a groan of protesting wood, the lid gave way. They peered into the darkness, the air rising from the well cold and damp. Lillian took a deep breath, bracing herself for what she might find. Eleanor retrieved a small, battery-powered torch from her bag, a precious item she'd managed to salvage from the hospital. She switched it on, directing the beam into the well. At the bottom of the well, partially submerged in murky water, was a small, metal box. It was waterproof, sealed tightly. Lillian reached down, her arms straining, and managed to grab the box. She pulled it out, her hands trembling. They opened the box, their fingers fumbling with the clasps. Inside, they found a collection of documents, carefully wrapped in oilcloth. Lillian unfolded one of the documents, her eyes scanning the words. It was a letter, written in German, and it was addressed to Colonel Moreau. Lillian couldn't read German, but Eleanor could. She took the letter, her eyes widening as she read. "This is it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "This is the proof. This is the evidence that Moreau is a traitor." The letter detailed Moreau's communications with the German High Command, outlining his agreement to provide them with information in exchange for money and safe passage. It was signed by a high-ranking German officer, and it included specific details about troop movements, supply routes, and strategic plans. Lillian felt a surge of relief, a wave of vindication. Nathaniel was innocent. He had been framed, betrayed by the very man who was supposed to be his superior. But their relief was short-lived. They heard footsteps approaching fast. They were not alone. Someone had seen them, or heard them. They had to get out of there, before they were discovered. The scars of the chateau held secrets, and those secrets were now in their hands, but the danger had only just begun. Chapter 12. The Unsent Letter. Lillian and Eleanor quickly gathered the documents, stuffing them into Eleanor's bag. They replaced the well cover, trying to make it look as undisturbed as possible. They knew they had to escape, and quickly, but the sound of approaching footsteps was growing louder. "This way," Eleanor whispered, pulling Lillian towards a narrow, arched doorway that led into the chateau. They slipped inside, into the darkness of the ruined building. The interior was a maze of crumbling corridors, collapsed rooms, and piles of rubble. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, and the silence was broken only by the scuttling of rats and the creak of loose timbers. They moved cautiously, their senses on high alert. They could hear the voices of the soldiers now, echoing through the ruins. They were searching for them, and they were getting closer. They found themselves in what had once been a grand hall, its ceiling partially collapsed, its floor covered in debris. A large, stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and empty. "We need to hide," Lillian whispered, her voice barely audible. "Somewhere they won't find us." They searched the hall, desperately looking for a hiding place. They found a small alcove, hidden behind a section of fallen wall. It was cramped, dark, and dusty, but it was the best they could do. They squeezed into the alcove, pulling a piece of rubble in front of them to conceal their presence. They held their breath, listening to the sounds of the soldiers approaching. The soldiers entered the hall, their boots crunching on the debris. They were speaking in hushed tones, their voices tense and urgent. "They must be here somewhere," one of the soldiers said. "Moreau will have our hides, if we don't find them." "Spread out," another soldier ordered. "Search every room, every corner. Don't let them escape." Lillian and Eleanor remained perfectly still, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could hear the soldiers moving through the hall, their footsteps getting closer and closer. One of the soldiers approached the alcove, his shadow falling across the rubble that concealed them. Lillian held her breath, her body tense, expecting to be discovered at any moment. The soldier paused, his gaze sweeping across the alcove. He reached out, his hand brushing against the rubble. Lillian closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But then, the soldier moved on. He hadn't seen them. He continued his search, his footsteps receding into the distance. Lillian and Eleanor remained hidden in the alcove, waiting until the sounds of the soldiers had faded away completely. They waited for what seemed like an eternity, their bodies stiff and aching, their nerves frayed. Finally, when they were sure that the soldiers were gone, they emerged from their hiding place. They were shaken, but they were safe for now. "We need to get out of here," Eleanor said, her voice urgent. "We can't stay here any longer." They made their way back through the ruins, moving cautiously, avoiding the areas where they had heard the soldiers. They reached the courtyard, and they saw that the military truck was still there. "We can take the truck," Lillian said. "We can drive back to Amiens to headquarters." But as they approached the truck, they saw something that made their hearts sink. The driver was back, and he was standing next to the truck, talking to another soldier. They were trapped. Lillian looked around desperately, searching for another way out. She spotted a small, wooden door, set into the wall of the chateau. It was old, weathered, and looked like it hadn't been opened in years. "That door," she whispered to Eleanor. "Maybe it leads to another way out." They made a dash for the door, their footsteps echoing across the courtyard. The driver saw them, and he shouted, alerting the other soldier. Lillian reached the door, her fingers fumbling with the rusty latch. It was stuck, jammed shut. She pulled harder, her muscles straining. The soldiers were running towards them, their rifles raised. Lillian pulled again, with all her might. The latch finally gave way, and the door creaked open. They slipped inside, slamming the door shut behind them. They found themselves in a narrow, dark passage. They could hear the soldiers pounding on the door, shouting at them to open up. They ran down the passage, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. They didn't know where they were going, but they had to get away, had to escape. At the end of the dark passage, Lillian found a folded piece of paper, yellowed, that seemed to have slipped out of the pocket of a long-abandoned coat. It was a letter, unsent, addressed to Nathaniel Blackwood, and the handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's. She clutched it, a new piece of the puzzle, as they continued their desperate flight. Chapter 13. Rendezvous in the Ruins. The passage twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the bowels of the chateau. Lillian held the unsent letter tightly, her mind racing. What did it say? What new clue did it hold? But there was no time to read it now. They had to focus on escaping. The pounding on the door behind them had stopped, but they knew the soldiers would be searching for another way in. They had to keep moving. The passage opened into a large underground chamber. It was damp, cold, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. The only light came from a few narrow shafts in the ceiling, casting dim, flickering beams onto the stone floor. "Where are we?" Lillian whispered, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I don't know," Eleanor replied, her eyes scanning the chamber. "But it looks like some kind of cellar. Or maybe a dungeon." They moved cautiously through the chamber, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor. They found a series of stone arches, leading to other passages, other chambers. It was a labyrinth, a maze of underground tunnels. "We need to find a way out," Lillian said, her voice urgent. "Before they find us." They chose a passage at random and began to walk. The passage was narrow, and the walls were damp and slimy. They could hear the dripping of water and the scuttling of rats. As they walked, Lillian finally had a moment to look at the letter she had found. She unfolded it carefully, the paper brittle and fragile. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. "My dearest Nathaniel," the letter began. "I fear this may be my last letter to you. I have discovered something terrible, something that could change the course of the war. Moreau is a traitor. He's been selling information to the enemy. I have proof, but I don't know how to get it to the right people.
I'm afraid, Nathaniel.
I'm afraid for my life, and for yours." Lillian's heart sank. The letter confirmed everything they had suspected. Moreau was the real traitor, and Thomas had known about it. But the letter also revealed that Thomas was in danger, that his life was at risk. "I'm hiding the evidence," the letter continued, "in a place where only you will find it. Remember the old well, at the chateau? The one we used to play near as children? It's there, hidden inside. You have to get it, Nathaniel. You have to expose Moreau before it's too late. The letter ended abruptly, without a signature. Lillian realized that this letter must have been written before Thomas had been stationed near Verriers, before he knew Nathaniel had been assigned to the mission. It was a desperate attempt to communicate with his friend, a message that had never reached its intended recipient. Lillian felt a wave of grief wash over her. Thomas had known the truth, and he had tried to warn Nathaniel, but he had been too late. He had been captured, or perhaps even killed, by Moreau. "We have to find Nathaniel," Lillian said, her voice filled with renewed determination. "We have to tell him about the letter, about Thomas." They continued their journey through the underground maze, their hope dwindling with each passing moment. They were lost, disoriented, and they had no idea how to get out. But then they heard a sound, a faint, distant sound, coming from somewhere ahead of them. It sounded like a voice. They moved cautiously towards the sound, their hearts pounding. The passage opened into another chamber, larger than the previous one. And there, standing in the center of the chamber, was a man. He was tall, gaunt, and his uniform was tattered and stained. His face was pale, and he had a haunted look in his eyes. But Lillian recognized him immediately. It was Nathaniel Blackwood. He looked at them, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Lillian?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Eleanor? Well, what are you doing here?" Lillian rushed towards him, her eyes filling with tears. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "We came to rescue you. We know the truth. We know you're innocent." Nathaniel stared at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and hope. "But how? How did you know?" Eleanor stepped forward, holding out the documents they had found in the well. "We have proof," she said. "Proof that Moreau is the real traitor." Nathaniel took the documents, his hands trembling. He scanned them quickly, his eyes widening in disbelief. This is incredible," he said. "This changes everything." He looked at Lillian, at the sorrow that was plain on her face. He reached to touch her cheek. "But where is Thomas? He is not with you?" The question, simple and direct, struck Lillian like a physical blow. The moment of reunion, of vindication, was shattered by the harsh reality of Thomas's absence. Chapter 14. The Price of Loyalty. Lillian's throat constricted, the words catching in her chest. She had been so focused on rescuing Nathaniel, on proving his innocence, that she had almost forgotten the primary reason for her journey to France, the search for her brother. "Thomas," she began, her voice trembling. "He's missing. Missing in action. That's why I came here. To France. To find him." Nathaniel's face paled. He stared at Lillian, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and grief. "Missing? But how? When?" Lillian recounted everything she knew, from the last letter Thomas had sent her, to his discovery of Moreau's treachery, to the unsent letter she had found in the chateau. She explained how Thomas had suspected Nathaniel was in danger, how he had tried to warn him, how he had hidden the evidence in the well. Nathaniel listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each word. He clenched his fists, his body trembling with barely suppressed rage. "Moreau," he whispered, his voice filled with venom. "He did this. He betrayed us all. He betrayed Thomas." "We have proof," Eleanor said, holding up the documents again. "We can expose him. We can clear your name." Nathaniel shook his head. "It's not enough," he said. "Moreau is powerful. He has connections. He'll find a way to discredit the evidence, to silence us." "But we can't just give up," Lillian said, her voice pleading. "We have to fight. We have to avenge Thomas." Nathaniel looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, profound sadness. "The price of loyalty is very high price, Lillian." Thomas understood. He'd risk everything. I need to know what happened." He closed his eyes for a moment, struggling to regain his composure. "We have to find out what happened to Thomas," he said, his voice firm. "We have to find out if he's still alive." "But how?" Eleanor asked. "Moreau has us trapped. He knows we're here." Nathaniel thought for a moment, his mind racing. "There's a tunnel," he said. "An old escape route, used during the siege of the chateau centuries ago. It's hidden, known only to a few. I discovered it while I was being held here. Can you show us? Lillian asked, her voice filled with hope. Nathaniel nodded.
It's our only chance, he said.
But it's dangerous. The tunnel is unstable, partially collapsed. And it leads to the outside, beyond the chateau walls, into the heart of enemy territory. They knew the risks, but they had no other choice. They had to escape, and they had to find out what happened to Thomas. Nathaniel led them through the maze of underground chambers, moving with a confidence that belied his weakened condition. He seemed to know the chateau intimately, every passage, every secret corner. They reached a section of wall that looked solid, unremarkable. But Nathaniel pressed a hidden lever, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow, dark opening. This is it, he said. The escape tunnel. Be careful. It's treacherous. They entered the tunnel, one by one, Nathaniel leading the way. The air was cold and damp, and the darkness was almost complete. They moved slowly, cautiously, their hands brushing against the rough stone walls. The tunnel was narrow, and they had to crawl in places. They could hear the dripping of water and the scuttling of rats. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, they heard a sound, a faint, rumbling sound, coming from somewhere ahead of them. What's that? Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with alarm. It's the tunnel, Nathaniel said. It's unstable. We have to hurry. They continued to crawl, the rumbling sound growing louder. They could feel the ground shaking beneath them. Suddenly, a section of the tunnel ceiling collapsed, sending a shower of rocks and debris down upon them. They cried out in alarm, scrambling to avoid the falling debris. Lillian felt a sharp pain in her arm, and she realized she had been hit by a falling rock. But there was no time to stop. They had to keep moving. They crawled through the dust and debris, their bodies bruised and aching. They reached the end of the tunnel, and they saw a faint glimmer of light. They emerged from the tunnel, blinking in the sudden brightness. They were outside the chateau walls, in a dense forest. They were free, but they were also in enemy territory, and their journey was far from over. The search for Thomas, and the weight of his sacrifice, now loomed larger than ever. Chapter 15. A dance in the dark. They were out of the chateau, but far from safe. The forest was dense, dark, and they were surrounded by enemy territory. The sounds of gunfire and explosions echoed in the distance, a constant reminder of the war that raged around them. We need to get to Amiens, Lillian said, her voice urgent. To headquarters. We need to expose Moreau. It's too dangerous, Nathaniel said. The roads are heavily guarded. We'll be captured. But we can't just stay here, Eleanor said. We'll freeze to death, or starve. They were at an impasse, trapped between the dangers of the forest and the certainty of capture if they returned to Amiens. Nathaniel thought for a moment, his mind racing. He remembered a small, abandoned village, not far from the chateau. It had been deserted by its inhabitants months ago after a heavy shelling. It was a risky place to go, as it was sometimes used by patrols, but it was their best chance of finding shelter and, perhaps, a way to contact the Allied forces. There's a village, he said. Not far from here. It's deserted, but it might offer some shelter. They decided to take the risk. They moved through the forest, cautiously, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the open paths. The forest was dense and the undergrowth was thick, making the going difficult. As they walked, Lillian couldn't help but think about Thomas. The unsent letter, his desperate attempt to warn Nathaniel, his bravery in the face of danger, it all pointed to a man who was willing to sacrifice everything for his beliefs, for his friends. He was a good man, Nathaniel, she said, her voice choked with emotion. A true hero. Nathaniel nodded, his eyes filled with sadness.
He was the best of us, he said.
He deserved better. They reached the village as darkness began to fall. It was a ghost town, a collection of shattered buildings, their windows dark and empty, their roofs partially collapsed. The streets were deserted, and the silence was broken only by the wind whistling through the broken windows. They found a small, relatively intact house at the edge of the village. It had been damaged by shelling, but the walls were still standing, and the roof was mostly intact. They entered cautiously, their senses on high alert. The interior of the house was dusty and filled with debris. Furniture was overturned, and the floor was covered in broken glass and plaster. But it was shelter, a place to rest, a place to plan their next move. They found some blankets and some candles in a cupboard, and they managed to start a small fire in the hearth. The fire provided warmth and light, a small measure of comfort in the midst of the surrounding desolation. As they sat by the fire, warming themselves, Nathaniel suddenly remembered something. "There's a radio," he said, "in the chateau. A secret transmitter, used by Moreau to communicate with the Germans."
"Can we use it?"
Lillian asked, her eyes gleaming with hope. "To contact headquarters?" "It's possible," Nathaniel said, "but it's risky. The radio is located in Moreau's office, deep inside the chateau, and it's likely to be heavily guarded. But if we can get to it," Eleanor said, "we can send a message, tell them about Moreau, about the evidence." It was a dangerous plan, a desperate gamble. But it was their best chance of exposing Moreau and clearing Nathaniel's name. And it was their only chance of finding out what happened to Thomas. They decided to wait until nightfall, then attempt to re-enter the chateau. They spent the remaining hours of daylight resting, planning, and preparing for the dangerous mission ahead. As darkness fell, they left the relative safety of the house and made their way back towards the chateau. The night was cold and clear, and the moon provided a faint, ethereal light. They moved silently, like shadows, through the deserted village, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. They approached the tunnel. They were about to go their separate ways, to try to reach the chateau by different routes when they heard something. Voices, muffled but close. There were people at the village's edge. It seemed a patrol had come, and now it was getting closer. Nathaniel pushed Lillian and Eleanor towards an abandoned bakery. "Hide there, behind the oven." They crouched, silently watching the shadows moving towards them. It was a waltz, a dance of life and death, in a world enveloped in darkness. Chapter 16. The Confession. Lillian and Eleanor huddled behind the large, brick oven, their bodies pressed against the cold, damp stone. The voices of the soldiers were getting closer, their footsteps crunching on the broken glass and debris that littered the village street. "Search every building," a voice commanded, harsh and guttural. "They can't have gone far." Lillian held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel Eleanor's body trembling beside her. They were trapped, cornered, and it seemed only a matter of time before they were discovered. The soldiers entered the bakery, their boots thudding on the wooden floor. They began searching the room, overturning furniture, smashing crockery, their movements rough and careless. Lillian closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. She prayed for a miracle, for some way out of this impossible situation. But then, she heard a different voice, a voice she recognized. It was Nathaniel's. "There's no one here, Sergeant," Nathaniel said, his voice calm and authoritative. "They must have moved on." Lillian's eyes snapped open. What was Nathaniel doing? Why was he helping the soldiers? She peeked out from behind the oven, and she saw Nathaniel standing in the center of the room, talking to the sergeant. He was wearing a German uniform, and he seemed to be in command. "But Captain Blackwood," the sergeant stammered, his voice confused. "Colonel Moreau gave us strict orders. I am countermanding those orders," Nathaniel said, his voice sharp. "I have reason to believe that the prisoners have escaped the area. We're wasting our time here." The sergeant hesitated, clearly unsure what to do. He was torn between his loyalty to Moreau and his respect for Nathaniel's rank. "But sir," the sergeant said, "the prisoners, they have information. Dangerous information." "I am aware of the information," Nathaniel said, "and I will deal with it. In my own way." He turned and walked towards the door, his back to the soldiers. "Return to the chateau," he ordered. "I will handle this." The sergeant, still hesitant, saluted and followed Nathaniel out of the bakery. The other soldiers followed, their footsteps receding into the distance. Lillian and Eleanor emerged from behind the oven, their bodies trembling with relief and confusion. "What was that all about?" Eleanor whispered, her voice bewildered. Why was Nathaniel wearing a German uniform? Why did he help the soldiers? Lillian didn't know. She was as confused as Eleanor. But she trusted Nathaniel. She had to. She had seen the kindness in his eyes, the strength in his character. She couldn't believe that he was a traitor. They waited for a few minutes, making sure that the soldiers were gone. Then, they cautiously left the bakery and made their way back towards the abandoned house where they had taken shelter. They found Nathaniel waiting for them inside. He was sitting by the fire, his face pale and drawn. He looked up as they entered, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Are you all right?" Lillian asked, her voice filled with concern. Nathaniel nodded.
"I had to do it," he said.
"I had to convince them that I was on their side. It was the only way to protect you." "But the uniform," Eleanor said. "The German uniform," Nathaniel explained. He had been captured by the Germans, but he had managed to convince them that he was a double agent, working for both sides. He had been providing them with false information, feeding them lies, while secretly trying to sabotage their operations. "It was a dangerous game," he said. "But it was the only way I could survive. And it was the only way I could gather information, find out what happened to Thomas." He told them that Moreau had been using him, manipulating him, to further his own treacherous plans. Moreau had known that Nathaniel was close to Thomas, and he had used that connection to frame him, to make him look like a traitor. "Moreau is the real enemy," Nathaniel said, his voice filled with anger. "He's been selling secrets to the Germans, betraying his country, causing the deaths of countless soldiers." Lillian showed Nathaniel the unsent letter from Thomas. He read the words of his friend, his eyes brimming. "And Thomas," Lillian said. "What happened to him?" Nathaniel's face darkened. He looked at Lillian, his eyes filled with a deep, profound sadness. "I don't know for sure," he said, his voice trembling. "But I fear the worst. Moreau had him captured. He knew that Thomas was suspicious, that he was getting close to the truth. I heard rumors that Thomas was interrogated, tortured, and then executed." Lillian felt a wave of grief wash over her, so intense that it took her breath away. She sank to the floor, her body shaking with sobs. Thomas, her brother, her dear, sweet brother gone. Eleanor knelt beside her, putting her arm around her, offering comfort. Nathaniel watched them, his heart aching with guilt and sorrow. He had failed to protect Thomas, failed to save him from Moreau's clutches. The confession, the truth, had come at a terrible price. And the weight of that price was almost unbearable. The fire crackled, the only sound in a room now filled with grief. Chapter 17. Escape from Montdidier. The news of Thomas's death was a devastating blow, but Lillian refused to succumb to despair. She had come to France to find the truth, and she would not leave until justice had been served. She owed it to Thomas, to his memory, to his sacrifice. "We have to expose Moreau," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We have to make sure he pays for what he's done." "I agree," Nathaniel said. "But we need a plan. We can't just walk into headquarters and accuse him. He's too powerful, too well-connected. We need irrefutable proof, something that will convince even his most loyal supporters." "The radio," Eleanor said. "The transmitter in Moreau's office. If we can get to it, we can send a message, tell them everything." It was a dangerous plan, but it was their best chance. They decided to attempt to re-enter the chateau, using Nathaniel's knowledge of the secret passages and tunnels. They waited until the dead of night, when the chateau was shrouded in darkness. They moved silently, like ghosts, through the deserted village, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. They reached the hidden entrance to the tunnel, the same one they had used to escape earlier. Nathaniel pressed the hidden lever, and the section of wall slid open, revealing the dark, narrow opening. They entered the tunnel, one by one, Nathaniel leading the way. The air was cold and damp, and the darkness was almost complete. They moved slowly, cautiously, their hands brushing against the rough stone walls. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, they heard a sound. A faint, echoing sound, coming from somewhere ahead of them. It sounded like voices. They stopped, their hearts pounding. They were not alone. Someone else was in the tunnel. Nathaniel motioned for them to be silent. He crept forward, cautiously, his senses on high alert. He peered around a corner and he saw two soldiers standing guard at the entrance to another passage. They were German soldiers, and they were heavily armed. They were talking in hushed tones, their voices tense and urgent. Nathaniel realized that Moreau must have discovered the escape tunnel. He had posted guards to prevent anyone from using it. They were trapped. They couldn't go forward and they couldn't go back. They were caught between the German soldiers and the entrance to the tunnel, which was likely also guarded. Nathaniel thought quickly. He knew that they couldn't fight their way out. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and they had no chance of winning a direct confrontation. He had an idea, a desperate gamble, but it was their only hope. He whispered his plan to Lillian and Eleanor, and they agreed to follow his lead. Nathaniel stepped out into the open, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. The German soldiers turned, startled, their rifles raised. "Don't shoot," Nathaniel said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I am Captain Blackwood. I am here to speak with Colonel Moreau." The soldiers hesitated, their eyes filled with confusion. They recognized Nathaniel, but they didn't understand why he was surrendering. "Captain Blackwood?" One of the soldiers said, his voice questioning. "But you're a prisoner. You escaped." "I was never a prisoner," Nathaniel said. "I am a double agent, working for both sides. I have information for Colonel Moreau. Vital information." The soldiers were still hesitant, but they lowered their rifles slightly. They didn't know what to believe. Nathaniel took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the soldiers. "Take me to Moreau," he said. "I will explain everything." The soldiers exchanged a look, then nodded. They motioned for Nathaniel to follow them, and they led him down the passage, towards Moreau's office. Lillian and Eleanor remained hidden in the tunnel, watching as Nathaniel disappeared around the corner. They were terrified for him, but they knew that he was doing what he had to do. Nathaniel's plan was to distract Moreau, to create an opportunity for Lillian and Eleanor to reach the radio transmitter and send their message. It was a dangerous plan, a desperate gamble, but it was their only hope. They were running, all together and separately, away from Montdidier and its secrets, towards an uncertain future. Chapter 18. The Heart's True North. While Nathaniel distracted Moreau, Lillian and Eleanor had to act swiftly. They crept out of their hiding place and followed the passage the soldiers had taken, staying close to the wall, moving as silently as possible. They knew that any sound, any mistake, could betray their presence. They reached a junction where the passage split in two directions. One way, they assumed, led to Moreau's office, where Nathaniel was now engaged in his risky deception. The other, they hoped, led to the radio room. They had no map, no guide, only their instincts and Nathaniel's brief description of the chateau's layout. They chose the passage that seemed less traveled, the one with fewer footprints on the dusty floor. They moved cautiously, their senses on high alert, listening for any sign of activity. The passage was narrow and winding, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. They passed several closed doors, each one a potential threat, a potential hiding place for enemy soldiers. Finally, they reached a door that looked different from the others. It was made of heavy oak, reinforced with iron bars, and it had a small, grated window. They peered through the window, and they saw a room filled with electronic equipment, a large transmitter, a receiver, a microphone, and various other devices. This was it, the radio room. But the door was locked, and they had no key. They needed to find a way to get inside, quickly, before Nathaniel's deception was discovered. Lillian examined the lock, her fingers probing the mechanism. It was an old lock, but it was sturdy. She doubted she could pick it, even if she had the proper tools. Eleanor, meanwhile, was searching the corridor, looking for anything that might be of use. She found a small, metal bar, lying on the floor near a pile of rubble. It was probably a broken piece from a piece of furniture, but it might be strong enough to force the door. She returned to the door, and she wedged the bar into the gap between the door and the frame, near the lock. She pushed, her muscles straining, but the door wouldn't budge. "Help me," she whispered to Lillian. Lillian joined her, and together they pushed on the bar, their combined strength focused on the single point. The wood creaked, and the metal groaned, but the door still held. They pushed again, harder this time, putting all their weight behind it. They could hear the wood splintering, the metal bending. Suddenly, with a loud crack, the door gave way. The lock broke, and the door swung open, revealing the radio room. They slipped inside, quickly closing the door behind them. They were in. Lillian rushed to the transmitter, her fingers flying over the controls. She had never operated a radio before, but she had seen it done, and she hoped she could remember the procedure. Eleanor, meanwhile, stood guard at the door, listening for any sounds of approaching soldiers. Lillian switched on the transmitter, and the tubes began to glow. She adjusted the frequency, trying to find the Allied headquarters channel. She heard static, then a faint voice, speaking in English. "This is calling headquarters," the voice said, crackling and distorted. Requesting assistance, Lillian grabbed the microphone, her hand trembling. "This is Lillian, right?" she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am at Le Corbeau Noir, near Montdidier. I have information about a traitor, Colonel Moreau. He is working for the Germans," she continued to speak, rapidly relaying everything she knew, about Moreau's treachery, about Nathaniel's innocence, about Thomas's death. She provided details, names, dates, anything that could help them understand the situation. She finished her message, her voice hoarse, her body trembling with exhaustion. She waited, her heart pounding, for a response. The radio crackled, and then a voice, clear and strong, filled the room. "We hear you, Lillian Wright. We understand. We are sending assistance. Hold your position." Lillian felt a wave of relief wash over her. They had done it. They had sent the message. They had exposed Moreau. But their relief was short-lived. They heard footsteps, approaching fast. They were not alone. Someone had heard them, or seen them. They had to get out of there, before they were discovered. Their hearts, though aligned in purpose, were now navigating a treacherous path, where every step could be their last. Chapter 19. Threads of Fate. Lillian and Eleanor quickly gathered the documents, stuffing them back into Eleanor's bag. They knew they had to escape, and quickly, before the approaching soldiers reached the radio room. "We have to go," Eleanor whispered, her voice urgent.
"Now."
They slipped out of the radio room, closing the door behind them. They moved swiftly and silently down the corridor, heading back towards the junction where they had separated from Nathaniel. But as they reached the junction, they saw him. He was running towards them, his face pale and strained. "They know," he said, his voice breathless. "Moreau knows. He's coming for us." They were trapped. Moreau was behind them, and the soldiers were likely searching the rest of the chateau. They had nowhere to go. "The tunnel," Lillian said, remembering the escape route they had used earlier. "We can try to reach the tunnel." But Nathaniel shook his head.
"It's too late," he said.
"They'll be guarding it. They know we used it before." They were at a dead end, surrounded by enemies, with no way out. Lillian felt a wave of despair wash over her. They had come so far, endured so much, only to be captured at the very end. But then Nathaniel remembered something. A secret passage, known only to him, a passage that even Moreau didn't know about. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was their only hope. "There's another way," he said, his voice filled with a renewed sense of determination.
"A hidden passage.
It leads to the outside, beyond the chateau walls." He led them down a different corridor, one they hadn't explored before. The passage was narrow and dark, and the air was thick with dust and cobwebs. They reached a section of wall that looked solid, unremarkable. But Nathaniel pressed a hidden button, concealed behind a loose stone, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow, dark opening. "This is it," he said. "The secret passage. Be careful. It's old and unstable." They entered the passage, one by one, Nathaniel leading the way. The air was cold and damp, and the darkness was almost complete. They moved slowly, cautiously, their hands brushing against the rough stone walls. The passage was narrow, and they had to crawl in places. They could hear the dripping of water and the scuttling of rats. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. As they moved deeper into the passage, they heard sounds, distant sounds, muffled by the thick stone walls. It sounded like shouting and gunfire. They realized that the Allied forces had arrived. They were attacking the chateau, trying to rescue them. The sounds of battle grew louder, closer. They could feel the vibrations of explosions, shaking the ground beneath them. They continued to crawl, their bodies bruised and aching. They reached the end of the passage, and they saw a faint glimmer of light. They emerged from the passage, blinking in the sudden brightness. They were outside the chateau walls, in a small, hidden courtyard. They were free, but the battle was still raging. Soldiers were fighting, guns were firing, and explosions were rocking the ground. They saw a group of Allied soldiers taking cover behind a ruined wall. They recognized the insignia on their uniforms. They were British, from Nathaniel's regiment. "We're here," Lillian shouted, waving her arms. "We're over here." The soldiers saw them, and they rushed towards them, their rifles raised. They recognized Nathaniel, and their faces lit up with relief. "Captain Blackwood," one of the soldiers said, his voice filled with surprise. "You're alive. We thought you were dead." "I'm alive," Nathaniel said. "And I have information. Vital information." He told them about Moreau, about his treachery, about the evidence they had found. The soldiers listened intently, their expressions growing grim. "We'll take care of Moreau," the soldier said. "You're safe now." They were escorted to a nearby field hospital, where they were treated for their injuries. Lillian's arm was bandaged, and Eleanor's cuts and bruises were cleaned and disinfected. Nathaniel, weakened but alive, was given medical attention. They were safe for now. But the war was far from over, and the battle for justice, for truth, had just begun. The threads of fate, woven through the darkness of war, had brought them together, tested their strength, and ultimately led them to freedom. But a reckoning was still to come. Chapter 20. Beyond the Trenches. The field hospital was a scene of controlled chaos. Wounded soldiers were being brought in constantly, the air was thick with the scent of blood and disinfectant, and the staff were working tirelessly, their faces etched with exhaustion. But amidst the chaos, Lillian, Eleanor, and Nathaniel found a moment of respite, a chance to gather their thoughts and plan their next move. The evidence they had gathered, the documents proving Moreau's treachery, had been handed over to the Allied command. An investigation was underway, and Moreau had been arrested, pending a court-martial. Nathaniel's name had been cleared, his reputation restored. He was no longer a suspected traitor, but a hero, a man who had risked his life to expose a dangerous conspiracy. But Lillian's heart was still heavy with grief. The news of Thomas's death had been a devastating blow, and she couldn't shake the feeling of loss, of emptiness. "He was a good man, Lillian," Nathaniel said, his voice filled with sadness. "He died a hero." "I know," Lillian said, her voice trembling. "But it's not enough. I wanted to bring him home. I wanted to see him again." Eleanor put her arm around Lillian, offering comfort. "He's at peace now, Lillian," she said. "He's beyond the trenches, beyond the pain and suffering of this war." Lillian nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She knew that Eleanor was right, but it didn't ease the pain. She would never see her brother again, never hear his laughter, never share his dreams. As the days passed, the war began to wind down. The Allied forces, bolstered by the arrival of American troops, were pushing back the German lines. The end was in sight, but the cost had been immense. Millions of lives had been lost, entire cities had been destroyed, and the world would never be the same. Lillian, Eleanor, and Nathaniel were discharged from the hospital, their wounds healed, their bodies scarred but their spirits unbroken. They had survived the war, but they would carry the memories, the pain, and the lessons with them forever. They decided to stay in France for a while to help with the rebuilding efforts. They worked tirelessly, assisting the wounded, comforting the bereaved, and helping to restore some semblance of normalcy to the shattered lives of the people around them. Lillian found solace in service, in helping others. It was a way to honor Thomas's memory, to continue his work of healing and compassion. She found a purpose in the ruins, a reason to keep going, a way to transform her grief into something positive. Nathaniel, too, found a new purpose. He had been a soldier, a warrior, but now he was a peacemaker, a builder, a man dedicated to creating a better world. He had seen the horrors of war, the devastating consequences of hatred and violence, and he was determined to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. He remained haunted, though. Eleanor, who had witnessed so much suffering and death as a nurse, found a renewed appreciation for life, for the simple joys of human connection. She had seen the worst of humanity, but she had also seen the best, the courage, the resilience, the compassion that could emerge even in the darkest of times. As the months passed, a bond formed between Lillian and Nathaniel, a bond forged in the crucible of war, strengthened by shared loss and shared purpose. They had been through so much together. They had seen each other at their weakest and at their strongest, and they had come to rely on each other, to trust each other implicitly. One evening, as they were sitting by a fire, watching the sunset over the fields of France, Nathaniel turned to Lillian, his eyes filled with a deep, profound emotion. "Lillian," he said, his voice hesitant, I know this is not the time or the place, but I have to tell you. I love you. I've loved you since before the war. Since the moment I met you." Lillian looked at him, her heart filled with a mixture of surprise and joy. She had known, deep down, that Nathaniel felt something for her, but she had never dared to hope, never allowed herself to dream of a future beyond the war. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice trembling, I love you too. I always have." They embraced, their bodies trembling with emotion. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, a moment of hope amidst the ruins, a promise of a future beyond the trenches, beyond the pain and suffering of the war. The world was still broken, but their hearts, somehow, were beginning to heal. The reckoning had come, and from its ashes, a fragile new beginning had emerged. Epilogue. Years later, the fields of France that had once been scarred by trenches and soaked in blood were once again vibrant with life. Wildflowers bloomed in abundance, their colors a stark contrast to the muted tones of memory that Lillian carried within her. The village of Verrières, once a ghost town, had slowly been rebuilt, stone by stone, its inhabitants returning with a cautious optimism, their faces etched with both the pain of the past and the hope for the future. Lillian and Nathaniel had made their home in a small cottage just outside the village, overlooking the rolling hills where the abandoned hospital still stood, a silent sentinel of a bygone era. They had chosen to stay in France, to build a life together amidst the landscape that had both tested and united them. The hospital remained untouched, a memorial of sorts. Lillian would often walk there, tracing the paths she had taken years ago, her fingers brushing against the cold stone walls where Nathaniel's name had been carved. The swallow, etched in the prison cell, had been carefully preserved, a symbol of hope that had endured through the darkest of times. Eleanor had returned to England, but she remained a close friend, their bond forged in the crucible of war unbreakable. They corresponded regularly, sharing their lives, their joys, and their sorrows, their letters a testament to the enduring power of friendship. Lillian and Nathaniel had built a life filled with purpose and meaning. They had adopted 2 children, orphaned by the war, giving them a loving home and a future filled with promise. They had dedicated their lives to helping others, to healing the wounds of war, both physical and emotional. They had become pillars of the community, respected and admired for their strength, their compassion, and their unwavering commitment to peace. The unsent letter from Thomas remained a cherished possession, a constant reminder of his bravery and sacrifice. Lillian had placed it in a small, wooden box, along with a faded photograph of her brother, a lock of his hair, and a dried wildflower she had picked from the fields near the chateau. It was a box of memories, a testament to a life lost too soon, but a life that had touched so many others. One spring morning, Lillian and Nathaniel walked hand in hand through the fields of wildflowers, their faces bathed in the warm sunlight. They had reached a point in their lives where the scars of the past had faded, replaced by a deep and abiding love, a love that had endured through the horrors of war and the challenges of peace. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" Lillian asked, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Nathaniel smiled, his eyes filled with a gentle wisdom. "Sometimes," he said, "but I don't dwell on it. The past is the past. We can't change it. All we can do is learn from it and build a better future." Lillian nodded, her heart filled with gratitude. She had found peace, she had found love, and she had found a purpose in life. She had come to France searching for answers, searching for her brother, and she had found so much more. She had found herself. As they stood there, surrounded by the beauty of the French countryside, a flock of swallows flew overhead, their graceful flight a symbol of hope, of renewal, of the enduring power of the human spirit. Lillian watched them, her heart filled with a sense of peace, a sense of belonging, a sense of coming home. The war had taken so much from her, but it had also given her something precious, something irreplaceable, a love that would last a lifetime, a love that had blossomed amidst the ruins, a love that had transcended the trenches and soared beyond the darkness. And in that love, she had found her true north, her guiding star, her reason to believe in a future filled with hope and promise. The echoes of the past still lingered, but they were no longer a source of pain, but a reminder of the strength they had found within themselves and within each other. The end.